Super excited to introduce my friend, Tom Landstreet. Over the last, goodness, Tom, I guess we met about a decade ago, maybe plus or so. We can thank the good Colonel Wallace, who was around town for quite some time, retired colonel from the U.S. military army, just a great man, and introduced me to Tom years and years ago. He came out and did a presentation for a group of business owners on economics, and at the time, he had just wrapped up just wrapped up, isn't that right? A stint with Art Laffer. So a lot of you folks are familiar with the name Art Laffer. Obviously has moved here to town, which is great to have him in Nashville. But more significantly, his work with supply side economics, and particularly with the Reagan administration as an economic advisor, very well known. And so Tom, in addition to working with him back before that, had spent time on Wall Street, has an amazing background in the financial sector as far as analysis, economics, and so we've got something a little different in store today. So as opposed to these technical subjects oftentimes we spend time on in tax or audit or a variety of other topics. So of course we have student night, which is a little bit a little different. This economic update is a little bit of a different flavor. So we're super excited, had great feedback from this morning. I think you guys are going to really enjoy getting to know my friend Tom. So I do want to hit a couple highlights though before I call him up here. So he is the co-founder and president of Trustco Investment Management. So in addition to his beautiful trophy wife, as Tom is very intentional to make sure I introduce her, so who is just sweet, but as I shared earlier, maybe a little cursed to have to be with Tom, and you'll get a flavor here in a little bit. So next to that, though, is his relationship with George Smith, who they have worked together for years, known each other since childhood, and do a phenomenal job in the asset management space, working with very sophisticated clients with very sophisticated approaches to how they work with asset management overall, in addition to integrating all of what Tom is getting ready to talk to us about when it comes to economics and particularly policy and how that integrates with economics and what markets do as a result of that. So in addition to Trustco Investment Management, he's the co-founder of N3L Capital Partners, which spent years and years, decades even, writing investment and economic analysis for hedge funds, particularly, a lot of subscribers to that. And he was born here in Nashville. He's a native. There's not many of those floating around here anymore, but Nashville native. And in addition to working up in New York City, he's kind of been all over the country over the course of his work. Brought him back to Nashville when he went to work with Avondale Partners. A lot of y'all folks may remember Avondale Partners had a great presence here in Nashville for a long time. Was a partner there before spinning out and beginning working on his own, and of course with George. And so just a great background. In addition to that, one of my favorite things about Tom Landstreet is he is not only a rock star when it comes to economics, but he's a bona fide rock star, and on top of that, a percussionist. So let's give Tom a welcome.
Played drums for a band, but I drum up business for our firm too. Thank you. And in March, we're going to be opening in Montana for James Taylor, my band. And I play with one of the guys from Old Crow Medicine Show. You ever heard of this band? Oh, yeah. Bluegrass band. They did Wagon Wheel. And so if you're watching Old Crow, he's the guy on the back right. He plays 3 instruments for them and 3 different ones for us. So I'm lucky enough to live in Nashville where I can ply my craft of economic analysis, managing money for people who need those services, and I get to rock and roll too with some of the greatest musicians in the world. So I guess I'm one of the many beneficiaries of the local environment. And so thanks a lot for that kind introduction, CJ. Don't believe a word of it, of course. But I did work with the great Arthur Laffer, developer of the Laffer curve. He studied and became known for his analysis of the dynamic effects of tax rates on behavior, something I would imagine would be a subject that would be very lively in this room. You all understand more than probably any group the effect of policies on behavior. And what I do is, George and I, for client portfolios and ourselves, we try to preserve money and make money. And of all the drivers in economics, the most dynamic, most predictable, most heavy-handed is surely government policy. It's bigger than droughts and famines and and demographics as far as a macro driver. It's government economic policy and its incentive effects on behavior and prices. So I personally run a long-short hedge fund. Yes, I'm an analyst. For years I've written for magazines like Forbes, and I've written for hedge funds and so forth, but when you're putting real money to work, it's a little different story. You're not just telling people what to do. If you're doing it, and if you're wrong, it's like getting hit in the head by a shovel. It's instant pain. So it's just a different world anyway, and I entered that world a few years ago, and we're alive and well. We're not doing poorly, and it's a lot of fun. So I invest where policy meets price. So what I'm gonna do is, like Economics 101, I'm just gonna go in, what is economics? It seems like a daunting subject to many people, but it should be very simple. And then I'm gonna go through what Arthur Laffer calls the 4 grand kingdoms of macroeconomics, which are monetary policy, fiscal policy, trade policy, and regulatory policy. It's through those 4 grand kingdoms that all policy is expressed. And by the way, that's in Brazil, and it's in Germany, and it's in the US, and it's in China, and people respond the same to incentives, whether they're in any language or any culture. And so that's the framework for my talk today. And we'll take questions at the end, which we had some very lively ones that put me right on the spot earlier. So I will expect the same from you all. Keep me on my toes. So again, oops, let me, hang on. Restart here, sorry gang. Economics. This is the definition from Webster's. A social science concerned chiefly with description and analysis of the production, distribution, and consumption of goods and services. So that's simple, but it's also profound. We have determined that really the best way to understand what's going on in the economy is to understand the main driver, the 800-pound gorilla, and that's government. And again, what government policies are expressed in the 4 grand kingdoms. Art Laffer used to say, if it works in an economy of 2, it works. Which his gift is to simplify things. But that was when I first heard that, I went, what? But it's kind of true, like on trade, free trade. Has anybody ever heard of David Ricardo? He wrote a book called Gains from Trade. It's an Economics 201 book, sophomore level. It's really extraordinary, and it's a beautiful story about trade and why trade, the free flow of goods and services across national boundaries, is beneficial to all participants. It really is 1 + 1 = 3. I do some things well, but there are things I do less well. CJ does things well, but there are things he does less well. Doesn't it make sense that we trade? I sell him the things I do well, and he sells me the things I do well. It really is 1 + 1 = 3. And of the grand kingdoms, I think it's the least appreciated. But the free flow of goods and services across national boundaries, it's accretive to growth for both parties. And I'll get into that later. We're going to start with fiscal policy because of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which was signed into law in 2016 by President Donald Trump. Oh, let me do a disclaimer. What I say sounds political, and it is, but it's not partisan. My job is to be an umpire. My job is to judge a policy, its incentive effects on behavior and prices, and not to get involved in the drama of politics. You with me? And I will tell you right now, and I know you'll all agree, neither party has a monopoly on bad ideas. In my talk, I will pick on Republicans and Democrats equally. Okay? So that disclaimer's clear, correct? So now I can go forward. Yeah. Fiscal policy, the tax cuts, derided as a tax cut for the rich, because of course it was a corporate tax cut. What did it do to the economy? Where do we stand post the tax cut? Well, it's pretty interesting, and it's actually it's the story of the day. This is median annual wage growth showing that wage gains among the lowest quartile of wage earners, what the BLS, which is the Bureau of Labor Statistics, federal agency, what they call non-supervisory employees, again, the lowest quartile in wage earners, experience the biggest wage gains of all the other cohorts. Almost 5% increase period over period in the most recently reported numbers. More than over 35 years. So when anyone tells you that tax cuts for the rich are for the rich and only the rich, they're not. They do trickle down, to use that pejorative from the Bush era. They made it down to the lowest quartile. The numbers are the numbers. And that's why our consumer economy is actually doing better than anybody expected, despite the trade skirmish. It's because a giant, 70% of our economy is consumer-led. You've got the rich, the 1%, but you've got this big, very large group at the bottom of the triangle, which is your non-supervisory employees, the lowest quartile. There's a lot of them, and when they get an incremental dollar of income, they spend it. And it's been very beneficial to the economy, in fact, carrying the day. It is why we are still above water in regard to GDP growth. And it's obvious in the numbers. Here's just another way to look at the same thing. Wages are growing faster for the low-wage workers. The blue line is the lowest wages. The red line's mid-wage, and the line that's rolling over is high wage, just so you know. Oh, by the way, also, I don't know if you noticed, the stock market's been doing very, very well. So the rich are spending like drunken sailors, and the lowest quartile, they're spending as well. So we have a consumer-led economy that's in decent, surprisingly good shape, again, despite the trade skirmish, which is a problem, and I'll get into it. And this is basically the U.S. versus the world indexes. And we've obviously been outperforming the world. If you look at Europe and Japan, or even in China, their policy mix is not as good as ours. Europe, an example, when I started my business, I went downtown to the Howard office building where I I registered my company and got an EIN, and I was in business in 28 minutes. In business. In France, you can't start a business. It takes like 2 years to get a business license in France. So tell me, how are you going to have a dynamic economy when entrepreneurs can't get a business license for 2 years after having the creative spark to try to go take that risk? Guess what? You don't. And you never will. Their labor rules are so egregious that you can't fire anybody. You cannot fire in France. So who's going to hire? That's why they have mid-teens unemployment. Europe is suffering from a malaise that is so entrenched in their government economic policy mix, mostly regulatory and high tax rates. They're done. I don't see a way out. We're lucky enough still to have some dynamism, not only among our people, which is amazing, but also in our policy mix. It's not the end of the world, although I'll scare the heck out of you at the end. Oh, can I tell a little story about a young accountant? We're going to try to have some fun today, do you mind? I got to go for like 2 hours. So can we have fun together, please? I want to talk about this stuff, but can I have fun? The earliest story I know about an accountant is a friend of mine's young, precocious daughter. They had moved to Nashville from another city, and she had gone to a new school. It was second grade. She comes home from school with her book bag and drops it at the door and runs into the house. And her mother was there for her, arrival. Of course, dying to know how the first day of school went at the new school. So she snuck down the hallway and she heard her daughter in there doing math. She was so pleased. First day, first minute of coming home, and she's in there doing math. And she hears her, going through her lesson out loud. And what she hears is, 1 plus 1, that sumbitch is 2. 2 plus 2, that sumbitch is 4. And mother crashed and said, Judy, where did you hear this? She goes, Miss Jones at school. Her mother, of course, livid, runs to the phone, sets up an appointment for the teacher and the principal. And when that day comes, she runs into the school, livid, naturally, says, what are you teaching my child? And she said, well, what did you hear? She said, well, she came in, she dropped her book bag, she goes to her room, she starts doing math. I asked her, here's what I hear, 1 plus 1, that sumbitch is 2. And the teacher started laughing, of course, which her mother had almost like lost it. Why are you laughing? She said, what I said was 1 plus 1, the sum of which is 2. CPAs are precocious. I had to get that out of the way. All right. I didn't get any guffaws, but I got some chortles. I guess we're awake, so I'll march on. There's more of that to come, too, by the way. Regulatory policies. So what this is, you've got tax policy, which is fiscal policy, tax rates, tax credits, depreciation rules, also subsidies. You've got regulatory policy, which is everything else. The millions of regulations, restrictions, and requirements imposed on businesses. It could be building safety requirements or food safety codes, but it's also the Affordable Care Act, so-called. It's also the ethanol mandate, which requires that 10% of every gallon of gasoline contain 10% ethanol, you know. So it's this is the regulatory apparatus, and boy, is it something. So another thing that this president has done is he's pulled back on the regulatory apparatus. He has significantly reduced the regulatory burden on businesses. So I know y'all are focused on tax rates. I'm focused on the whole policy mix. This right here has been very significant to our GDP growth. And I'll go through some anecdotes as to why that is. And by the way, remember, this isn't political, but the last regime, presidents, I referred to Barack Obama, who I like personally very much. I referred to his regime as they had a regulatory jihad. They wanted to regulate everything that moves, wiggles, and crawls in the private sector. And by the way, they're a bunch of lawyers, so I'm not going to blame them. They didn't maybe they didn't know better, but they did it. And I'll go through some details. But this president has done something quite interesting. And in this chart, you can see fewer costly regulations. This is the sum total number of regulations with over $100 million in economic consequence in the real economy. And this comes from a Washington-based government-associated statistical source. Under George W. Bush, remember I said Republicans and Democrats, I think George Bush is a fine man and so was his father, but I got to tell you, they were not great presidents. In my humble opinion, forgive me, Lord, I've sinned for saying that. And I could go through it one-on-one with you why, but it's all economics. That's it. I don't care. If he lets the economy breathe, he's good. Or she. This is interesting. He passed 465 ambitious regulatory initiatives with over $100 million economic consequence. Barack Obama passed 647 of them, and here Trump's done 229. That right there, to me, it pulls back the regulatory blanket, which allows the fires of commerce to burn a little hotter.
Are those all one-term numbers?
Year to date. I'll try to go backwards.
Those other two were two-term presidents.
Okay, yeah, so that was just for a short period of time. It's not for the whole terms. He could turn around and destroy everything any minute. I don't trust any politicians, period, end of story. And by the way, half the time it's their advisors. You know, federal deregulation has saved an estimated $23 billion in the real economy. Surprisingly, some of it comes from Health and Human Services, HHS, under Alex Azar, former pharmaceutical executive that many people derided. You know, he was going to be a representative of the dirty pharmaceutical companies. But what they've done is they've been very, very creative in their policy mix, governing reimbursements mostly from Medicare and Medicaid. They're actually setting up reimbursement models for an episode of care, which might be a knee replacement, whereby they pay a doctor more, not for doing more, not for doing more surgeries, not for doing more, but actually for doing less. They actually get reimbursed for saving money in an episode of care. And guess what? It's bending the cost curve down. It's incentivized doctors to be stewards of the spend, not profligate spenders. That takes a certain amount of creativity, especially in Washington. They're not geared to be creative or to try anything new. Spend money, take the safest route, and get reelected. That's the palsy. But I got to tell you, I'm impressed. I really am shocked and impressed that government is doing something that I like. Another thing, remember, I'm agnostic. I'm on the front row seat, though, to watch the train wreck that is government economic policies. And I've been forced through my experience to have to study boom-bust cycles in all continents and throughout history. And I've become quite a cynic when it comes to government. Full disclosure. This is an example of regulations gone wild. So this is U.S. field production of oil since 19 20. You can see that it's upward sloping. You can see that in the 1960s it goes parabolic. And then it just turns on a dime, and U.S. oil production goes into a 40-year decline. What caused this 40-year decline was a decision made in Washington by a Republican by the name of Richard Nixon. Remember I told you neither party has a monopoly on bad ideas? Well, here's an example. I'm going to pick on Democrats and Republicans. I'm an equal opportunity critic, okay? In this case, the administration, and by the way, Nixon was reported to have one of the smartest and most intellectual administrations among any in modern history, all right? Reported. They were scared of a broad inflation. And they were scared that oil prices would lift off and bleed through the broad economy. Back then, in the 70s, oil was a much greater input per unit of GDP growth. In other words, we relied on oil a lot more than we do now, currently, right? So it was a major input. And they were worried about a broad inflationary drift, and oil prices were leading the way. And so they, in their infinite wisdom, decided to cap prices. They call them wellhead price controls. They're famous. Go Google it. Nixon enacted wellhead price controls and wage and price controls. I'm sure you've heard of them. Maybe you've not read about them. But here's what they are in reality. Let's pretend that each of you represents an oil company in 1971. Each of you is a CEO of an oil company, production company. Most of you, by the way, were in Texas and some in Alaska, some in Oklahoma. And I'm the president, and I'm worried about a general drift in oil prices leading to an inflationary drift. So I convene all the CEOs, and here we are in this meeting today, and I've got to tell you this. I'm going to cap what you can charge per barrel of oil below the market price, starting today. Okay, that happened. Now, you tell me, what's the incentive to go out and find the incremental barrel of oil and produce it? It's greatly diminished. What happened to oil production? 40-year decline. That happened. That's in the history books. Those numbers are real, legit. One decision, one wise decision, simply let's cap inflation by capping prices, which incentivizes people not to produce. And oil prices went to all-time highs, setting off a broad inflation. There were other things going on at the time. I don't want to talk about the moving off a gold standard or any of this. This is what it is. So my point is, regulatory decisions like this have significant ramifications for the broad economy. Everybody with me on that? Sound reasonable? Back to trade policy. Again, the free flow of goods and services across national boundaries is good for everyone. It just makes sense. And it's hard to find somebody who's not a free trader. And by the way, this is the one area of Donald Trump. Now, I did not like Donald Trump initially at all, and I still don't like him. Who could? He's a curmudgeon. He can't complete a sentence. He's grimacing all the time. He's not my kind of guy. We would not be friends. Okay. However, I will tell you, I'm surprised and impressed by the policy mix. I'd say he's got very good policy instincts, similar to Ronald Reagan, in the deregulatory aspect, in the tax cutting aspect, because I believe very much that those types of policies lead to growth, and growth leads to prosperity, and so forth. So, and I know I'm treading lightly here because of the controversial character that he is, so I went ahead and tell you, I don't really like him, but I am kind of impressed so far. Anything could change. Trade policy is something that I reacted very, very aggressively against when I heard tariffs. I'm like, no, because again, it's very accretive. However, of all the policies that he has embarked on, this is the one that both Democrats and Republicans tend to agree on. I have friends in the Silicon Valley. The president at Salesforce.com is a friend. And a lifelong Democrat, by the way, and very intelligent, obviously, Stanford grad. And he says of all the policies, this is the one we're on board with. We have been ripped off for decades by China. They're a bad actor. All our IP is gone. It's unbelievable. We sign our lives away when we go to sell in that market, and everything's stolen. Everyone will agree that the policy idea or standing up to that was not a bad idea. It may have cost the economy, it did, but it's interesting to see that the Democrats agree with this. What bothers me is that why did it take the grimacing Donald Trump to bring this up? If everybody knew it, including some of the smartest, most well-connected Democrats that I know of, Why didn't anybody ever address this before? Where were our prior executives? Where was anybody on this topic? Very strange to me, how that worked out. Anyway, here we are. China trade is really collapsed, and they are, very dependent on us. They're now 20% of the global economy, by the way. The last time, we had a trade hiccup, they were only about 7% of the global. Now they're 20, so it's much greater consequence to the well-being of the world, in my opinion. And look, their China exports to the U.S. is down almost 10%. No, almost 20, 15. Oh, it says 16 right there, sorry. China industrial enterprise profit year over year. Profits, down 10% here. So when China posts their GDP growth numbers, or they do their ISM numbers, you know what those are? Institution for Supply Management, their industrial production numbers, and C&B trumpets it, and they talk about it all day long. It's in the Wall Street Journal, it's in the business side of the New York Times, and they say we grew at 6.1% up magically again. It's always within a decimal point, by the way. Here's the news. They're not growing that fast. It's a manufactured number. They're probably in recession. How do I know? These numbers are published. These numbers are profits that are from publicly traded companies that have to publish their numbers and file with the securities authorities, and they're down 10%. China's in recession, which brings me to this coronavirus. The reason everybody's freaking out about this thing is they cannot trust the purveyor of information. They cannot trust that these numbers are real. And why? Well, there's your answer. We have a history here. And that's why there's so much paranoia about this thing. We're not getting the right numbers, and there's no telling what they are. And I bet they don't even know them. All right. Remember, the tax cuts were accretive to growth, not only to the lowest quartile wage earner, but also to corporate profit margins. And I would argue to the broad economy. Very accretive. The trade skirmish probably reduces, according to this source, 40% of the benefit of of the tax cuts. Are you with me? So it is weighing on the economy, no doubt about it. But without the tax cuts, we'd probably be in a recession, in my opinion. I think we're probably dangerously close as we speak. So that's trade policy. With me on that? Free trade, free flow of goods and services, accretive to all participants, very important to the well-being of the world, in my opinion. Monetary policy, I'm going to spend the rest of my time on this one. And the reason is because we are in uncharted territory. Because some of the policy initiatives coming from the monetary authorities around the world are unprecedented, and not by a little bit, by hundreds of %. And we don't know the outcome. And I'm about to scare some CPAs. Everybody with me? Take a drink. I'm going to take a drink of my coffee, get excited. Monetary policy refers to central banks globally. In Europe, it's the ECB, European Central Bank, the Bank of Japan, Bank of China, and our own Federal Reserve, right? They're in charge of the money supply and interest rates. They probably are, second to God, the most powerful force on earth. They certainly think they are. First, I'm going to describe how we got here. This bull market over the last, since the housing crisis, has, I'd say, surprised everyone at the strength of it. We've had a 300% increase in financial assets. By the way, this is widely publicized, but the recovery from the 2009 downturn was the weakest on record from a recession. And okay, that's also just numbers, data. It was the weakest recovery on record from a recession. Period. End of story. How so then, among a sluggish economy over the last decade, did financial assets increase 300%? Oh, the Federal Reserve, I'll tell you how. Gladly. I'm glad you asked. This is, where's my little thing here? Here. Whoa. Sorry, gang. Okay. This is the 2008-09 crisis, and zero interest rate policy, which had never been heretofore to practice, was implemented, which reversed the market declines in March of 2009 and sent the market rallying. So the Fed ran to the rescue of declining financial assets, depression, or whatever they wanted to call it. I would argue they went a little overboard. You might also remember during this period of time, they passed a number of spending measures, by the way, under George Bush, Republican, and Hank Paulson, Secretary of the Treasury. They decided then that they would take $900 billion in new debt and send checks to Joe Sixpack and his wife, $600 to an individual, $1,200 to a family, by the way, for something other than work effort, thinking that if they sent this mailbox money to us, that we would then go out and spend that money. And for every dollar they gave us, it would trickle through the economy and turn into exactly $2.3. That was the math they used. Okay, I saw the vice president's chief economist in a group like this argue for that Keynesian multiplier, they call it, the Keynesian multiplier, that there's a snowball effect, that if you give people money, they'll go spend it and it grows. By the way, it belies logic. And it didn't happen in any way. But they failed to think that the $900 billion in money, remember, they sent this in mailbox money. They gave people $600 for something other than work effort. I would argue there's friction to that. I've got children. If I gave them free money, would I expect them to work? Sorry, pal. I mean, I could develop a welfare state in my own house. Anyway, they did it. It ended up, the dollar was a 0.8. It turns out that Joe Sixpack saved some of it and didn't spend it. It wasn't accretive, but the debt never went away. It was $900 billion in new debt. Put it on that side of the ledger. Again, for something other than work effort. That sounds subtle, but it's profound, in my opinion. There's friction to it. Oh, back to this. Then you can see Operation Twist, where the Federal Reserve went out to buy assets off of bank balance sheets. They bought short-term assets and replaced them with long-term assets. Then you've got quantitative easing in 2012. This is the most interesting to me. QE, anybody heard of it? Quantitative easing, which is the federal government, the monetary authority, the central bank prints new money. You all are the banks. JP Morgan, Morgan Stanley, Merrill Lynch. I buy off of your balance sheet. I buy from you troubled assets. I take them on my balance sheet and I give you fresh money. It's called quantitative easing, okay? And it literally is injecting huge amounts of money into the economy, expecting that economy will that money will take root and grow. They failed to realize that the rest of the government apparatus was increasing tax rates and increasing regulations. Remember I said the regulatory jihad. Everything from the EPA to the Federal Labor Relations Board were increasing their regulations of the private economy, of individual companies, and were basically extinguishing the fires of commerce. So the entire apparatus, regulatory apparatus, is out there tamping down growth, and then the authorities lean on the Fed to make easy money available, hoping loans would be made and we could stoke growth. It's schizophrenic. It's probably immoral. But it's what they did. We were not in a recession in 2012. Go look. We're growing like 1.5%. Why did they pull out the big guns and go into quantitative easing? There was pressure to grow faster. And yet, again, the regulatory apparatus was there penalizing growth. That's the policy mix. Janet Yellen announces, remember the dot plots, any of this? I mean, I'm glued to this, so I don't know if you all pay attention, but the Federal Reserve decided that they were going to telepath to market participants. Okay, you're Goldman Sachs, you're Merrill. We're going to raise rates, read my lips, 3 or 4 times in the next year. We're going to raise rates 1/4 point. Everybody got it? Get ready. We're going to raise rates now. And they did it. And look what happened to the market. Oink. Collapsed. Then, of course, like girls in a scary movie, and she made an announcement. Just kidding. We're going to stop there at that 1 interest rate increase, and we're not going to do it again. She reversed so quickly, it was unbelievable. George and I watch this drama for a living, safely in our office in historic Berry Hill, Nashville. But it was phenomenal to watch all the effort made to transmit to the market that we were going to raise these rates and please be prepared. Then it happens, the market market falls, and they just reverse completely and revert back to monetary policy easing. The Yellen pause. Trump elected, not really a consequence in this story. Rate increases. So Jerome Powell, Jay Powell, the new Fed chief, a lawyer, by the way, not an economist, not a PhD. Did you know that the Federal Reserve employs 800 PhDs on their staff? I thought that was interesting. 800 PhDs to come up with this stuff. My mother would be a better Fed chairman because she understands simple stuff. Like, if it works in an economy of two, it works. Right? Logic. We have to live within the bounds of logic here on earth. Not the highest paid and educated PhDs, they don't. And there are no consequences to their behavior. Anyway, Jay Powell came into office as a hawk. He clearly wanted to normalize rates, which is to allow them to drift higher, to normalize them, to stop this zero interest rate policy, low interest rates and easy money. And he was taught a quick lesson. He too tried the dot plot. Okay, remember, you're market participants. I'm Jay Powell. I'm going to raise rates 4 or 5 times. We're going to try this again. Okay, class? I'm going to raise rates 4 or 5 times, and I'm actually going to shrink the Fed's balance sheet, which I'll show you later, was bloated. Remember, they went and bought all the assets off the bank balance sheets? Their own balance sheet swelled to enormous, unprecedented proportions through that process, and he decided he would shrink the Fed's balance sheet and normalize rates. Everybody ready? Everybody nod. You're on board. You're the banks. And then he did it. And then October, we swooned in 2018. Then in December of 2018, we had this little thing. At 20%, y'all remember that? It was like, it was Christmas Eve, and the market was down like another 3%. And everybody who had an ear for this or had a 401k or was paying attention was like, oh my God, this is the worst Christmas ever. No Santa Claus rally this year. It was unbelievable. And violent, and rapid, and shocking. So they reversed. Fed pivot. In this case, former hawk, Jay Powell, rookie, assembled for his announcement that he was going to pivot or stop the rate increases. He got Yellen on one side and Bernanke on the other to support him during the announcement, which I thought was kind of funny. Dad, Mom, help, I'm in trouble. It was, to me, I just laughed. I thought, oh, you wussy. Anyway, here we are, and he pivoted, and the market reacted, and we're up again. Yay, it's all good now. Okay, so then he tried it. He wanted to raise rates once again, and remember in 2019 in the summer, he cut rates 3 times now, right? So he's reversed. He's going back down. There was a little hiccup, a little surprise eruption in a corner of the financial markets called the repo market. Is anybody aware of the repo market? Have you heard this word bandied about in the fall of last year? They're called repurchase agreements. And there was this wild little skirmish over in the corner of this capital market, this obscure world over here that led the Fed to completely reverse and start buying treasuries again. In other words, revert to quantitative easing. So as of September of 2019, they're now buying every month $60 billion of treasury securities in the open market per month. Total $500 billion plus. And they opened up a line of credit to this repo market thing over here of $300 billion. Does anybody remember when the 2008 crisis happened and a couple of money market funds broke the buck? Does anybody recall this from the drama of those days? And everybody in our industry, which is, hyperactive, watching this stuff for a living, when these money market funds broke the buck, we all looked over and went, what is that? And in fact, on CNBC, everybody was like, what is this? What's the deal? This is a real problem. And it literally was only minutes later when the whole economy just, and the market's with it. This repo hiccup in September of 2019 is just like that. It's an obscure little product over here in the corner of the markets that showed extreme stress. And the Fed this time, rather than not doing something, threw the entire bucket at it once again. And they reverted to QE, quantitative easing. 60 billion, as we speak, they're buying in the open market 60 billion in treasuries a month. It's like this, in my opinion, the risk to it. Let's say you're my employees. You're my board of directors. It's a big one. I'm the CEO. And I have sheepishly called you to a meeting to tell you that I've mismanaged the company. Our revenues are declining fast, and I have taken on way too much debt that I cannot service. And either I can fire you all and I go to debtor prison, or I've got a solution. A buddy of mine is a counterfeiter. I'm going to get him to create money and I'm going to pay down the debt with that. Thank you for the chuckle. The $60 billion in new money is money just freshly created to pay down prior debt obligations. It's not only not accretive to the economy, because remember, you're paying prior obligations, but it increases the balance sheet once again and creates a cosmic risk, I think, for our country and our markets. And I am very worried about it because it's never been done. And I'll show you. Okay, so that's the Fed's bull market. You with me, everybody? Pretty sunny outlook right here. Oh, I forgot. My son put these cool black accents on each of the call-outs, and I should have used that, and I didn't. So he's probably listening online. Son, I'm so sorry I did not listen to your your admonition that I do that better. Okay, disclosure. This is money supply, base money, dollars in circulation. Okay. See this little thing right here? That blip, everybody? That was 9/11. I could take this chart of money supply back to the 1917 when the Fed was started, and this little blip here would still be an outlier. It still would be an extreme increase in the money supply relative to the past pattern. And yet, look what's happened since 2009. 300% increase in the money supply. Unprecedented by such a measure that we really do not know at this point the outcome of this. But it is what our central bank is doing. And by the way, they're not alone. Anyway, the budget deficit, this is a big problem. The reason they're doing that, the reason the Fed is printing new money, they're monetizing our debt, paying past obligations. We have $1 trillion annual deficit now, right? $1 trillion a year. That's just federal government operations. Did you know there's 53,000 people in the Department of Transportation? Employees. And they don't have orange vests on. That's administrative personnel at the Department of Transportation. 53,000 at highest union wages. Anyway, we're at $1 trillion annual deficits now. Okay? And that does not include Social Security and Medicare, which are unfunded liabilities. 10,000 baby boomers today, 10,000 baby boomers tomorrow will be eligible for Social Security. 10,000 baby boomers per day are now eligible for Social Security, and Social Security is now sending out $1 trillion more annually in checks to recipients, to beneficiaries, than they're taking in payroll taxes currently. Oh, by the way, there's no trust fund. When Social Security was first formed, there was a trust fund. You actually paid in to a system, and it was there, and they invested it, and the money was actually there. Under Lyndon Baines Johnson, they decided they would borrow that money. You get an IOU. That money's not there. That was your money. That was my mom and dad's money. They paid into it in good faith. If you all paid into my system and I promised you something and I didn't return, and I didn't follow through with it, I'd probably be liable legally, but it's the government. They've got us in a corner, and the Fed's helping us get out of it. This is U.S. federal government debt. This is the term structure of federal government debt. It comes due in 5 years, the preponderance of it. 11 trillion. So if you know how Treasury debt works, I sell a 3-year bond, a 10-year bond, now a 20-year bond, 30-year bond. I sell them to investors. I take that money and I run the government with it. Okay? They have to refinance trillions of dollars of federal government debt over the ensuing several years, and demand is drying up for this paper. There's not enough money. Oh, so that's why the Fed's buying 60 billion of it a month. They're monetizing the debt. Does everybody get that concept? With new money, they're paying down old obligations. They're allowing profligacy. They're not only allowing it, they're incentivizing it. There's no consequences to this behavior. Because we got the Fed, we got your back. Just as okay, here's Treasury debt outstanding. Looks sort of like the money supply, doesn't it? That's bond issuance. Is that shocking just to me, or are you guys like, whoa? That could be blue shirts and in the market, and you go, what is the deal, right? So this is what I want to sound the alarm about a little bit to you CPAs. All is not good. The market inches up every day, and we're all happy, and underneath the emperor has no clothes, and it's worrying this analyst significantly. And I'm really a mess about it, and so I brought it. You all are my, how do I say, you're my counseling group. You're my therapist. I want to share my anxiety a little bit with you people who get it. Oh, by the way, European Central Bank, you think they're any better? How about $16 trillion of sovereign debt that's yielding negative interest rates? So if you're a worker in Poland, a new member of the European Union, and you've paid into your Social Security system, they are forced by law to buy this stuff. So every dollar of hard-earned money that you're forced to put into your pension gives you 91 cents back. What kind of deal is that, folks? Wow, that's a ripoff. $16 trillion today in negative yielding sovereign debt. By the way, a very interesting story. Since I got 2 hours, I'll share this. 3 hours, sorry. 2. Just kidding. I had you. Poland, since Lech Walesa, remember that name? Turned from a communist country, from a socialist country, to basically a capitalist country. They cut rates, they cut tax rates, they deregulated, they sold off government-owned enterprises, and this is a really functioning European country. It's the fastest grower in Europe by far. And it's become the outsourced manufacturing facility for Germany. They manufacture a lot of the car parts and so forth for Germany. And it's Poland. And recently, the head of the Polish Central Bank, fed up with the ECB's policy of negative interest rates, wrote a letter to the European Central Bank Chairman, Mario Draghi. And he said, as the steward of my citizens' hard-earned savings, I feel compelled to share with you that I am no longer inclined or interested in taking our hard-earned savings and buying your stinky ECB paper that gives me back 91 cents on the dollar. In fact, I have a moral dilemma. Because again, these are my citizens and this is their hard-earned money. So hereby we're announcing a 100-ton purchase of gold. And he wrote this thing and he sent it, and I thought it was very interesting for a variety of reasons. One, it was morally, it showed backbone. And it was intelligent. And two, central banks hate it when you run to gold. It drives them nuts. It's like having a bunker away from their, it's protected. They don't want that. It drives them nuts. I just love it because it's provocative. And he's right on. And I'll go into that later. Here's another problem. 60% of NASDAQ companies have junk bond rated debt. Okay, these are the constituents that make up the NASDAQ index. Thousands of companies. 60% of them have junk bond rated debt. Junk, as you know, the word junk means stinky, means not exactly healthy, not really good actually. And a lot of this debt's 6, 7, 8%. Okay? This is why the Fed is painted in a corner and has to do what they're doing with lower interest rates and $60 billion of Treasury purchases. One, the federal government itself. You saw the term structure of interest rates. They've got to issue trillions of dollars of treasuries into this environment, so the Fed has to buy them because there may not be buyers otherwise. Two, NASDAQ companies are loaded, engorged with debt. A downturn or a recession could tip off some of these companies into bankruptcy, and it could become a contagion, a grass fire. And I'm convinced of that. Ford Motor, great American company. Ford just reported their numbers, okay? They made $47 million. Oh, by the way, last year this time they did $1.3 billion in profits. $47 million in profits in the most recent quarter. They have $45 billion in debt. Ford is one notch above junk today. My worry is, auto sales are down double digits. China's auto sales are down 25, 30% or more. You could see something like that happen where we wake up one day and Moody's or S&P has downgraded Ford and we are looking at a meltdown. I'm not a chicken little. I'm very optimistic besides. But this I can't not worry about this. Here's another issue. Covenant light loans at a record. Do y'all remember during the housing crisis when you could go get a loan without having to show documentation of a job? They called them no-doc loans. And you could also get a loan for 120% of the stated value of the home. 120% loan to value. In Wilson County and in Murfreesboro, these counties that were growing so quickly, there were lots of people going out and getting a loan, not having to show documentation of a job, and getting 120% loan to value and buying a boat. And that's what happened. So here we have the corporate analog. Because the Federal Reserve has lowered interest rates so much, there's a cosmic chase for yield, demand for yield among savers, investors. And they are now, because they can't get it in the Treasury world, and they can't get it from the ECB, and they can't get it from the BOJ, Bank of Japan, they're buying junk bond debt by buying piles of it. And they are, by virtue of that, allowing companies to issue more and more debt with little consequence to the lender. Covenant light loans have little recourse to the lender. Isn't that what happened in the housing crisis? They had little recourse. We're there. The debt burden has jumped from households whose balance sheets have largely repaired to corporate and government. It didn't go anywhere. It jumped the railroad tracks. It's still there. It's still with us. And the Federal Reserve is still having to feed this beast through $60 billion a month Treasury purchases. Are you with me on all that logic, everybody? Covenant light loans. Makes me sad. This is interesting. Money center banks. You've heard the term money center banks. It's all the big guys. JP Morgan, Wells Fargo, Bank of America. They're money center banks. To be a money center bank, you get certain privileges, lots of them. But you also have certain responsibilities. One of them is you have to show up at the Treasury auctions. We expect you to be there and to buy these treasuries as we issue them. Okay, so it's an obligation. The federal government has issued so many treasuries. These banks have been required to buy these treasuries, so their balance sheets are bloated with treasury debt. All-time high. See that picture? Cash on bank balance sheets is plummeting, therefore. So when I talked about the repo market hiccup, which happened in September, it's the greatest irony that I can think of in my recent days. That in the midst of the largest injection of money into the system, you saw money supply. You saw the Fed's balance sheet. You trust that they have injected tons of money into the system. In the midst of the largest injection of money into the system, there's a credit crisis. How does that work? One, there's too much debt. They can't stop feeding it. If they stop feeding it, you have a crisis or a meltdown or a contagion. It's both corporate balance sheets. The more debt you have, the more debt you need before you go and rationalize your business, right? And your need is urgent, and it's always crisis level. We're there. And the repo market, I'll go ahead and tell you what it was. It was a normally functioning, very liquid market, loan market between corporations. I'm going to pretend we're all corporations. Each of our corporations, and we're large, by the way, by definition, we're big companies. We all have a financial arm of our business. I might be Ford. I got Ford Credit. CJ's GM, and he's got GMAC. You might be Caterpillar, and you've got Caterpillar Lending. I'm saying that to you because you're falling asleep. No, I'm just kidding. Teasing. You're John Deere, and you've got Deere Credit, right? You're Deutsche Bank. The repo market is this really liquid, really functioning market whereby each of us CEOs of these major corporations can loan to each other money on a short-term basis at a very low interest rate. And all I got to do to get some money from you perhaps is to post my securities, treasuries, or post securities that are on my balance sheet as collateral. You give me a $30 million loan, and I have my capital needs met, and then I give it back to you tomorrow perhaps, or maybe next week. They're daily. They roll them over every day. It's a several trillion-dollar market between corporations on a buddy system where, again, I post collateral, you give me a loan, I'll give you unwind it in a week or 3 days or 2 days or 1 day. It's very functioning, it's very liquid, it's very big. It's never seen what it saw in September. Interest rates, which are usually at the lowest level, right around where the Fed funds rate is. At the time, it was 2%. I mean, it's an overnight loan. $30 million at 2%, I'll give it back to you tomorrow. If I carry it through, it's 2% for the next. It's very low interest rate. Interest rates on September 17th of 2019 shot to 10% in the repo market out of nowhere. In other words, you weren't willing to make that loan to me. But what about our prior relation? It dried up out of nowhere. And companies were not able to meet their short-term loan, the short-term capital obligations. And the Federal Reserve woke up that Monday and opened up a line of credit and threw $300 billion at the repo market in an open PO, like an open line of credit, and became the lender, replacing each other, the free market side of it. That's what happened. Scared the living daylights out of everyone in the market participants, observers, investors, and the Fed. And that's why they reversed. That's why they threw $300 billion at the repo market. You can look it up. It's cool. It's very interesting, if not disturbing. And then they embarked on the $60 billion a month Treasury purchases as a result of this hiccup that happened in an obscure corner of the capital markets called the repo market, very similar to the hiccup that happened in an obscure corner of the capital markets back in 2008 called the money markets. Very similar. I just want to draw that analogy. And the reason it happened was, part of the reason was, banks didn't have the cash to service the needs of the repo market suddenly because they have been engorged with treasury debt that they're obligated to buy. Everybody with me on this? So this strange paradox of the largest capital injections in the history of man have led to extreme conditions and tightness. And to me, that's a really wild, profound irony. And it scares me because I think the Fed's in a corner. So you can go to Forbes.com and hit Thomas Landstreet, my name, and you'll find an article I wrote called "The Fed is on a Razor's Edge." And it describes the dilemma that they have. They're stuck. They're painted in a corner. There's so much federal debt, so much government debt, and so much corporate debt that if they were to dare raise rates and make the cost of money more expensive. One, the federal government will have to pay hundreds of millions more to service that debt. Remember, their interest rate goes up too, and they can't afford it. But two, corporations can't. If I'm that CEO and that I made that announcement earlier that I've run the company basically in the ground, we have 8% debt and I can't service it. If they raise rates, I can service it even less. They can't allow it to happen, folks. That's why they've backed down from quantitative tightening. That's why they've reversed and started cutting rates again. That's why they will not raise rates during our lifetime. That's why we will never see high interest rates unless there's an absolute calamity that forces them to, and it might be inflation. 70s style inflation, where 18% interest rates are required. I'm not predicting it, but I am scared of it. That's just the money supply again, which I just wanted to kind of come back to. Amidst the largest infusion in capital in the world into the economy, we have a credit crisis looming, and that's why the Federal Reserve is doing what they're doing. So I don't know how long I've gone, but I'd love to answer questions. I've gone about an hour. Anybody got any questions for me, or should I just start riffing again? I know you don't want the latter. Yes, ma'am.
What actions would you take to kind of ameliorate the carnage that will be coming?
So I don't know that there's several ways out of this. Okay. People ask me, what is the market going to do? Is it going to go down 10%? Yes, absolutely, it could. I think we're on the razor's edge, but the Fed has said numerous times that they're not going to let a financial market meltdown lead us into a recession, which means they've got your back. They'll do anything to prevent a meltdown, which says that they're going to continue. That's why I predict they're going to continue to cut or keep rates low and inject money into the system. Because I don't think they can handle the consequences. Okay, that's one thing. It's going to be something that comes out of an obscure corner of the capital markets that nobody's expecting, that sets off a contagion where there's a meltdown. But again, the Fed is going to come at it with everything. So I think the Fed is obviously going to drive the capital markets. And let's pretend we have an election where Donald Trump does not win, and you have somebody like Bernie Sanders win. Right? So what has he said he's going to do? And what has Elizabeth Warren said? First thing, we're going to shut off fracking. You saw my chart of oil production shooting up until Richard Nixon imposes wellhead price controls, production collapses, and then fracking saves the day. People ask me, how did fracking come about? And I'll tell you how. The federal government had been, had put on a moratorium on drilling for oil in places where it's cheap and plentiful. Offshore, shallow water. Alaska, which used to be the #1 producing oil state, they're now #9. It's not because they're running out of hydrocarbons. It's because the federal government owns 90% of the landmass of Alaska, and they shut it down. They stopped exploration or allowing exploration and production on federal lands. By the way, it's the largest landowner in the entire world. They own hundreds and hundreds and millions of acres. And so basically there was a moratorium on drilling for oil where it was cheap and plentiful. Okay? And then fracking comes along. How did fracking happen? I'll tell you, it's an end run against those moratoria. And the way it is, it happens on private land. They can't stop it. Fracking equals private property rights. It couldn't be shut down by even the most nefarious leaders. Plus technology, which is horizontal drilling, plus capital, which is money needing a return, equals fracking. And it saved the day. You with me? The first thing several presidential candidates would do is shut fracking down. Remember, we're the marginal producer now. We're the #1 producer in the world. Some years ago, it was assumed that we were running out of oil. We'd be forever beholden to the Middle East for our oil. And now we're the number one producer on earth and gaining. Remember when the Saudi oil facility got hit by the drone strike about 4 months ago? Knocked out 30% of their production overnight? Do you remember what oil prices did? Good answer. Nothing. They yawned. If that had happened under the prior regime, or if that had happened under a regime that had curtailed our oil exploration and production, prices would have shot the moon, and we would have had significant issues in the real economy. But because of the deregulatory apparatus, we are now producing enough oil to where it just doesn't matter. And it's a national security issue. We're much safer producing our own oil, okay? I'm not going to go into carbon, and I'm not going to go into global warming. I'm just going to tell you, for the economy and for national security, it's not a bad idea to be self-sufficient here. There are a lot of bad actors out there in the world, and oil has been a notorious tool to bash the good, you know? So, did I answer your question?
I'm just kind of wrapping my head around all the things that are going to be coming,
Yeah.
having lived through what we've already lived through, at least me.
Well, so
My investments are going to be, how do you invest in your 401k? What considerations, do you take into your investment strategy when you know that these things are coming?
okay.
A position will give you 2%, really?
Yes, so we do this for a living for people, for individuals like yourself and for your clients, okay? And we are very, very concerned about this question for our clients. We want to do the best thing for them, so we have a policy. We look at this stuff. First off, we're not chasing the market. With new money, we're being very cautious, okay? It just so happens that we also have adopted a new investment idea, which is we're buying precious metals miners, gold and silver, as a hedge. I can short stocks, I do, but the market's been going up and it's not paid me very well. Tesla is an example. And I'm an analyst, okay? I look at the income statement and the quality of earnings. Tesla grew their revenues 2% last quarter, okay? And if you look at their income statement, they actually increased their accounts payable by 40% quarter over quarter, which means in my world that they're probably stiffing their vendors to make their numbers. And on CNBC, they were harumphing. They're finally profitable. Tesla's profitable. See, it's a model that works on 2% revenue growth. And they increased their accounts payable by 40% in the midst. Nobody's doing their work. They all own ETFs. No one's working on that stuff now. This can't last. Did anybody see Charlie Munger's comments the other day? You know who Charlie Munger is, a famous partner of Warren Buffett. Sage old curmudgeon of 91 years old. And he was in some interview and he goes, I'm not going to say the word, don't worry, CJ. He said, corporate earnings are fake. They're all bull. And the interviewer was like, oh, that's interesting, Charlie, tell me about that. He goes, what is adjusted EBITDA? And he went on. Great question, you're accountants. So let's go through this one. I've been in the capital markets my whole life, right? I've seen booms and busts. I've seen good companies and bad companies. I've seen good accounting and terrible accounting. And I'm not an accountant. But I got real money at work, so I actually have to pay attention to it because I don't want to get hurt for my clients and me. So adjusted EBITDA and adjusted earnings. When you look at an earnings report, they're all reporting adjusted EBITDA and adjusted earnings. If you look very closely, there's no uniformity between what they're adjusting for. There's no gap apples to apples. One company can come up with adjusted and you're coming up with another adjusted. And the market is, we're fine. I'm not going to inquire any further, thank you. Now people ask me, well, what's that? I get that. Oh, by the way, they're adjusting revenues now. I thought revenues, I'm a simple person, was money in the cash register. And then you could adjust earnings by, okay, we had a CapEx issue or pro forma for an acquisition, so we can adjust and normalize. Maybe I can accept a little of that, right? But that's not all. They're adjusting for everything. All these one-time costs are actually many-time costs. They're the cost of doing business. They're basically removing the cost of doing business from their numbers and posting these EBITDA numbers, and everybody's going, yay, great, yeah. And they're calling it EBITDA, but it's adjusted EBITDA, and we're all good. Let me ask you a question, your accountants. With the debt looming, with that kind of debt out there, can you pay debt with adjusted EBITDA? Nope. So when people ask me, when is this going to matter? And well, when the excrement hits the fan and they actually can't meet their debt obligations because adjusted EBITDA doesn't cut it. When does that day come? I don't know, but it's going to come. Because the real world has a way of making itself known. I feel like what the Federal Reserve has done is, one, get us addicted to easy money. Two, it has allowed for this indulgence in debt. Bless you. You're good. Need a tissue? If you sneeze again, you're fishing for blessings. Okay. That was a petite little sneeze, though. Thank you. You don't have corona, do you? I'm joking. Like an opioid addict, if anybody's familiar with this disease, which I unfortunately, because of some family members, had to acquaint myself with its ravages, its pattern. If you have an opioid addict that has been addicted to opioids for some period of time and that person enters rehab, they never abruptly curtail their use because it'll kill the host body. They wean them off of it using Suboxone and other treatments. And so my worry is that with with our economy becoming so addicted to easy money, they tried to wean us off, and the host body started gyrating, hemorrhaging, and they reversed. And so I think this is where we stand. We're addicted to it. The government's addicted to it. Corporations have indulged in debt. Precious metals. Precious metals, again, remember, I want to short Tesla, but it was up $40 in my face on weak accounting. So it's like I can't, obviously. But how do I hedge for my clients? Precious metals. Why? Interesting. I'm glad you asked. Here's how we think. It's a deeply cyclical industry, commodity industry. When commodity prices go through a downturn, the corporations in the business of producing the commodity are forced to cut their debt, rationalize their production, and right-size their businesses. They basically take production offline, and they live within their means during a commodity price downturn. And then when commodity prices come out of the doldrums, these companies, once again, they're fit now, right? They rationalize their production, cut their debt, etc. They come out and they just print money in the early move of a commodity upcycle. And then, of course, they become indulgent, take on debt, start doing unwise M&A, and end up basket cases again. But that's later in the cycle. And I can tell you that happens in the oil patch. If anybody's been an oil stock investor, in the copper, and zinc, in the minerals area. And it happens also in precious metals, gold and silver. So they were just through the downturn. They have been through the doldrums. We've been watching the industry. There's hundreds of publicly traded miners, and there's a lot less debt in that industry than most others. And there's very little excess. And now, because of the things I've mentioned, gold prices have perked up. Time last year, gold prices were maybe $1,200 an ounce. They're now approaching $1,600. They're up a lot today. $1,200 to $1,600, $400 difference. We're a gold producer. We have an all-in cost of production of $1,000 an ounce in our 3 mines. Last year we were getting $1,200, so we had a $200 profit margin. I've got to pay for everybody's employment and the equipment and so forth. We're mildly profitable, but at $1,600, we're printing money. So when you look at the earnings season coming up, this one group is going to have some of the most explosive earnings on the board. And I don't have to rely on them to make good business decisions yet. Remember, we're early in the cycle. The commodity price is up, up, up. And all they got to do is sell their production at the prevailing price, and it's profits. I don't trust anyone. I told you earlier, I'm not I'm not a politically driven person. I don't get involved in the emotion, but I do have a front row seat to the train wreck that is government policy. And I don't trust anything I read or hear, nor do I trust company reports. So, but I will tell you, this industry, it's in great shape right now. The price of the commodity is ripping, going up. And what's interesting about it is it's a proper hedge. The reason is because you're not shorting Tesla and getting hurt by just emotion, irrational exuberance. It's a proper hedge against a meltdown, which could happen. We could wake up one day and the China thing or a Ford downgrade, and suddenly we're down 10% in a few days in the markets. The gold goes up. It's contrary. The movement is contrary to the broad markets. And inflation, which is really the risk of having so much money printing. And inflation, in my opinion, would be guaranteed if we had someone like Bernie Sanders elected president, who will, by the way, shut down production immediately. He's going to raise the minimum wage to forever, and he's going to cut down oil production. He's going to basically re-regulate everything, which means we will have less production, less output, and still more money. Because remember the chart where I showed where Janet Yellen embarked on quantitative easing, and I told you that we weren't in a recession during that period? Do you remember that chart? We were growing at 1.5%. There was no need to get so aggressive and do QE, and they did it anyway because they were trying to boost growth, because the rest of the government was tampering down growth with the regulatory apparatus. Remember, they did it anyway? Under a Bernie Sanders, what will happen, and I promise this, if they go and they restrict production and we go into a recession, you know who they're going to lean on to bring growth out again? The Fed. Start printing money now, thinking that's going to be a solution. Guaranteed. So under that scenario, I guarantee you inflation. Remember I said it. If I'm wrong, I don't want to hear it. If I'm right, I want all the accolades. Okay? And get CJ too. So inflation looms. A meltdown may or may not happen. We are on a precipice. We're on a razor edge, but the Fed's got everybody is doing stuff that's unprecedented. George and I sit around and think this stuff through all day long. Poor guy has to listen to me rant and rave and for our client's sake, and contemplate these matters so that when and if we are there, we're prepared. And precious metals has been one thing that we've decided. I'm not a gold bug. I think they're weird. I know they're weird. But in this case, it makes all the sense in the world. Come on, more questions. Somebody? Yes, sir.
Hearing your talk on monetary policy sounds a little bit like a Ponzi scheme that has no solution, long-term solution in sight. Are there big thinkers in our country or abroad who see a way to reverse the trend on that? And I mean, is there a, I'm not trying to be fatalistic here, but is there a way out of this with some of the other economic policy to turn the tide?
Well, there is a way out, I think, and it's a tough policy prescription that maybe politicians are unwilling to embark on because of their expedient need for re-election or whatever. So, understand that there is an answer, but they may not reach that conclusion themselves. Are there other people very worried about this? Well, yeah, Bernanke is. Oh, no, sorry. Greenspan is sounding the alarm. Some hedge fund managers, including Ray Dalio, ever heard of him? Ray Dalio? He's got the largest hedge fund in the world, like $136 billion. Biggest ever. He's sounding the alarm. Some other investors, Paul Tudor Jones, a Memphis native, $8 billion hedge fund, Tudor Investments, he's sounding the alarm. Charlie Munger is sounding the alarm. Judy Shelton has sounded the alarm. Does that name ring a bell? Judy Shelton was just proposed to the Fed by Donald Trump. And Judy Shelton was laughed out of the room. She is no longer a candidate for the Federal Reserve. It's like a club. You cannot join this club unless you're drinking the Kool-Aid. And you know, the lack of that out there, by the way, makes me worry that I'm wrong. I really worry every day that I've concocted this and I'm absolutely bonkers. It's a weird feeling. And the reason is it's such a cosmic riddle. It's so big. These things are unprecedented by 300%. But here's what I do know. The second everybody agrees on something, and there's little room for dissension, nor is there tolerance for dissension, it's time for this kid to go the opposite direction. I've seen it my whole life. I've seen it on the playground when friends were treating someone unfairly or poorly. I saw it in my college fraternity, the way boys behaved. I've seen this stuff. I'm a simple person. It worries me. I'm going the other direction. I may miss out on the last bit of the market. And the weird thing is these things blow up and it's like nobody saw it coming. You know, nobody saw the housing crisis. What? Nobody saw the repo hiccup. The 800 PhDs at the Fed didn't see that? Anyway, I don't know if I answered your question. Protect your assets. It's not the time to swing for the fences. The last person investing is going to get hurt. The last dollar, you know. Yes.
Well, you said there was an answer, but you didn't know if any of the politicians would get to it because they wouldn't be reelected. But what is the answer?
Well, okay, great question. Okay, thank you for keeping me on track. An example would be with the federal government deficit. They'll tell you there's 53,000 people in the Department of Transportation, and they're not even wearing orange vests, getting paid highest union wages. Cut some fat. If the regulatory burden is lifted from the private sector, they'll be hiring those people. Hey, we have a very low unemployment rate right now. Wages are rising. Why? They need workers. Those people would be so quickly sucked up into the private sector, but they don't want to be. Then they have to actually report to a boss and they might get fired. It's much better being a full-time employee with tenure and not having any risk to being fired with great pensions, right? And over market wages. But the truth is they got to make some painful decisions and simply cut expenditures. We have $1 trillion annual budget deficit. The other thing is unfunded liabilities, Medicare and Medicaid. Honestly, it should be privatized. They'll never do that. You know, the only country with a sound, and what I mean is flush, pension system in the world is Chile. Chile in 1994 privatized their pension system. It's an elaborate 401k plan where they just simply, with tax credits, incentivize people to save on their own. They have no government liability in that area. That would be easy. Brazil, another Latin American country, has just recently cut their pension obligations substantially by changing the actuarial tables. In Brazil, up until recently, if you're a woman, you could retire at 50 and get paid more money than you were paid when you were working. A man could retire at 54 with more money. 54! These days, that's very young. In fact, very young and lots of experience. That's probably the best worker because they actually have experience too. Energy, experience. And they've incentivized them to leave the workforce and then put them on the dole that they can't afford. So they've recently changed the actuarial tables and literally saved the country. Recently in Brazil. And they just basically increased the retirement age by a few years. They lowered the very generous pensions for government workers. that takes guts. And by the way, their military, was huge. So for their most protected class, the government worker class, they actually did the hard decision. Politicians cut their very generous benefits, changed the actuarial tables. They've saved the country. And Moody's, or was it S&P? S&P upgraded Brazil's debt in December And Moody's is preparing to do it, I think, in April. So Brazil is the only country I can find on earth with a accelerating GDP growth rate, possibly because of these changes in their policies, by the way. Not possibly, absolutely because of those and other pro-growth policies. But it's the only country on earth that is actually growing their GDP, growing their production, their economy, and getting Moody's debt rating increases. So it can be done. It's a tough just to cut spending and address Social Security and the unfunded liabilities. Remember that we paid into the Social Security system initially, and it was money in a lockbox. It was actually there, and they produced a return with that money, and it was there. And now, under Lyndon Baines Johnson, they borrowed it. All of it. None of it's there. It's an IOU. You pay into it, and a lot of money over time. You get a paltry sum back, but it's only based on the government's current cash flow. There is no money there. That's a shocker, right? You all knew that. I don't know why there aren't pitchforks. I don't know why people aren't going, stop messing. But maybe that's what Trump is. In fact, I know it is. I got to ask you, how the heck did that guy get elected? He's unattractive in every way. He's grimacing. He can't finish a sentence. He's really one of the most unattractive and belligerent people I've ever seen. And I don't like him. And he would not be my friend. However, his policy instincts are as good as Reagan's. He's cut tax rates and he's deregulated. Wow. And he's done something that even Democrats like. He's standing down on China. I got to tell you, I never would have predicted that. Ever. Ever. And I'm still shocked at it. And honestly pleased. I still don't like him. You know? I've learned that morality is not a prerequisite to be a good president. And I used to think it was. And a lot of people still do. My guess is Bloomberg does. Let's go back and look at that one. The Bushes, who I know personally. I will tell you now, and I know this, they're fine people. They're moral people. They're good people. I do like them. I do trust them. But their policies were terrible. George Sr. ran on a policy, I'll not raise taxes. First thing he did was raise taxes. Remember, read my lips? The old joke is, you couldn't read his lips because his Pinocchio nose was growing so big from the lie that that was an Art Laffer joke. And then he was a one-term president. Listen, you have to be pretty bad to lose a second term to get president. You have all the power. You have all the purse strings. You have everything. You have the narrative. You have the moral imperative. You've got it all. And if you can't get reelected, something's wrong. And then George W., fine man. I really like him. And I hope he never knows I speak like this because I like him. But the ethanol mandate that he signed into law, the stuff he did was absolutely terrible. Misguided, ill-advised, bad policy, Republican. Nixon, Republican. Oh, and Clinton. Well, I would argue he's a moral basket case. We know it. Not a bad president, though. Surprisingly, not a bad president at all. In fact, honestly, in hindsight especially, good president. What? Immoral, good president, moral, bad president? Again, it's not a prerequisite. I've learned that, and I think it's very important as voters that we know that. It's policy. What are they going to do to either accentuate growth or penalize growth? Foster enterprise or other? That's the way I see it. Yes, CJ.
Tom, come back to trade policy. So we've kind of had, 1.0 of trade policy, the first settlement, so to speak. There's more conversation out here around the tariff battle. So what happens? We saw the impact of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act on your previous slide, showing, some great monetary, some GDP stimulus. So then we saw the negative effect of tariffs. So what happens with 2.0? No TCJA out there in order to help GDP growth to stimulate the economy, but we have 2.0 kind of around the corner, so to speak. on trade.
Okay, that's a great question. You all hear that? It's about the trade deal. We have first phase signed. We're good. Next. And then phase 2. First off, I read phase 1. It had no teeth. It was very disappointing. There's really no obligation there. They agreed to buy more soybeans than we produce. It doesn't make sense to me. And it has no teeth. And it's 90 pages long. And so I'm a cynic. Okay? Item 1. China can't possibly give that stuff up. There's no way China could have done what they've done in the last 20 years without ripping off our intellectual property, period, end of story. They fast forward their development by basically riffing off of our work. And that is a fact. I don't believe that they're going to stop doing that today. 2, how are we going to, we're requiring that they no longer have government subsidized industries. Let's think about that one. The Communist Party is the government. By the way, the Communist Party is the private sector as well. They have all the power. Okay, I'm Xi, all the power. Guess who runs the companies? My cousins, my family, and my friends. The people that run their businesses are political appointees because they are favored political relationships. Okay? Without government support, they don't exist, and vice versa. It's symbiotic. The Communist Party is the industrial economy. We will never, ever extricate the Communist Party from the means of production in China, because then they'll lose their power. And we know what they'll do to sustain power. We've seen it. Anything. You think our government's bad? Look at Mao. 50 million dead. We have a little collateral damage here, but not that, right? So we will never get that. And we are asking for it. We won't get it. So I'm a cynic. That won't happen. So what will happen? Tariffs. I think they remain in place. The current regime. Oh, by the way, did you see where recently we've announced that Huawei is a bad actor? Just the other day, maybe last week. Huawei is the big communications equipment maker, the leader in 5G. And we have apparently figured out lately, and it's been an elevated topic around the intelligence community, that they have embedded in their systems the ability to monitor us and maybe even regulate us and maybe even shut down our systems. Can you imagine if the internet went down? How many drivers out there would wreck? What happened to my GPS? I don't know, We rely so much on it. We're very vulnerable. And so anyway, we have now elevated Huawei to a security threat since phase 1. Yesterday, we decided that GE is not now allowed to sell their jet engines to China to facilitate their new jet fleet that they're hoping, commercial jets fleet. Okay? So here we have it. Industrial warfare now, beyond tariffs. We're calling Huawei out, and we are doing everything in our power to diminish Huawei. We are not going to allow our innovative jet engines to be sold to this country. So now ask me about phase 2. I don't think it happens. I think the trade war has now become a legit war of sorts. And I don't think we're going to miraculously end up with a phase 2 and all's good. I'm just watching this stuff. If all was good, we'd sell them jet engines. And I'm not judging it. I'm not one to say they are bad actors, don't sell them jet engines. Remember, it's not my role. My role is only to observe it and then to try to extrapolate what does it mean. And in the context of the trade agreements, what does it mean? And to me, it's escalation. To me, it's a sign that this thing ain't going to be over that quickly. Am I wrong? Does that seem illogical? That's kind of where I come down. I just don't think it's going to be blowing over. And I'm telling you, the coronavirus is a lot worse than they say. I'm pretty worried about the next quarter. Apple guided down, stock's probably up. What? You guide down your earnings and you miss numbers and the stock's up. Oh, that's basically what's been going on for several years. Again, Fed infused, because they know in the slightest hiccup who's coming to the rescue? The Fed. It's called the Fed put. They used to call it was the Greenspan put or the Bernanke put? It was a term that was once bandied about, but there you go. It's the Fed. We now all economic participants, market participants know with perfect certainty that if the excrement hits the fan, the Fed's coming to the rescue. So how do you behave? Irresponsibly, perhaps. Maybe you take on a little more risk than you would ordinarily want to, right? Sort of like the housing crisis. People ask, how did that happen in a freely functioning economy? I'll tell you how. The government. They blamed greedy bankers. And I'll never defend a banker, a greedy banker. But they play by the rules they're dealt, largely. And the government issues the rules. I would argue without Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac guaranteeing that paper meaning the debt, that bankers would never have been incentivized to give no-doc loans 100%, 120% loan to value. If that's my money or our money, guess who's not doing that loan? We. Then why on earth would logical, sophisticated, modern people do that? Because the government guaranteed it, and there was no risk to it. And we saw what happened. So now let's look at covenant-light loans being issued by 60% of NASDAQ companies with junk bond debt, and they're buying everything they can of it. And then I own Apple even though they're going to miss numbers because I know the Fed's got my back. Are there parallels or is it just me? There are parallels. Strong parallels. There's no consequences to our risky behavior, and that scares me alone. And again, I can't tell you when it's going to happen. But if it does, and you please remember that I was going, and you'll know that I'm making money. And until then, I'm not. So I wish it would happen. No, I'm just kidding. I do wake up every day such a pessimist that I'm like, oh, the market's up again. Darn it. Not true. Kind of true. Yes, sir.
You said precious metals for new money investments. What about current positions?
Repeat that.
You said precious metals for new money. Is it the same thing for current positions? Are you getting out stuff into precious metals, or are you short?
I have a short position that is not presently working. It's dampening my returns in the fund. What George does is totally different for his clients, which are individuals and foundations. His responsibilities are different. People hire me to be like a sniper, finding ideas and getting after them and making money in a down market and up market, but especially to be protected in a down market. George has a different purview altogether. But that's a good question. In my portfolio, which is what I'll speak of, I look at government policies and their incentive effects on behavior. So I'm going to make it a little sunnier. I look at monetary, fiscal, trade, and regulatory. We dealt with monetary. I'm scared to death. But I understand the market going up because the Fed's got our back. But regulatory policy. Some of the things that I'm invested in are doing very well. And an example would be gambling legalization, gaming, sports betting. You may know that 20 states, including Tennessee, have actually legalized sports gaming. And 14 of them have come out with rules. Most of them allow you to do it on your phone. The idea being that if we're sitting around watching TV and it's an SEC game, that we can very easily bet real money on the outcome of the game, but also within the game. Does he get it in the end zone? Stuff like that. Intra-game betting. It's a regulatory change that was brought about in 2018 by federal statute that allowed gaming, and then state by state is now legalizing it because they want the tax revenues. And those states that have done it are getting so much in tax revenues, the neighboring states are feeling pressured to do it. And so it's right now it is a train that's left the station. It's in early days, and there are about 8 or 10 public companies that I think are going to be huge growers because of this deregulatory trend. Another one is state-level infrastructure spending. You know, everybody wants the federal government to embark on infrastructure for some other reason. But It's something that certainly the Democrats want. I don't know why. Maybe the unions get the best beneficiary. But states, 39 states have pretty ambitious infrastructure spending projects underway. 10-year plans. They've allocated the money and they're spending it. I-440 is an example. California, a number of states that have underinvested in infrastructure are really, really doing it. It's baked in, it's in their budgets. They're raising gas prices to pay for it, it's done. The market could come apart and this group is going to do well. You with me? So there are a bunch of names in there. Vulcan Materials, they're an aggregate producer. Gravel. Martin Marietta Materials. Summit Materials. Why I like these companies is, again, it's baked in. It's a 10-year spending bench, accelerated spending activity among states. And you can't export this stuff. It's so heavy that the mines, the gravel mines that are nearby, are the ones that they benefit the most. So there's two areas where I see things happening on the state level that have led to a whole group of stocks that I've bought that are actually doing quite well, and I don't have to worry about Apple, and I don't have to worry about Google and Facebook, that are, 5 stocks were responsible for 70% of the S&P's move last year? 5 stocks. So it's a very narrow market, in my opinion, very low disbursement, somewhat unhealthy. But where do I find ideas? In things like this, policy action. You got any other ideas for me to talk about?
As an individual, I would say that you have to have an expectation on where you think returns are. If you want to keep up with the market and ignore all risks, then you can certainly do that. Otherwise, you pull back a little bit from your range of expectations. So if my maximum in equity is 70%, it might be down at 50 right now, or 55, and just pull back a little bit and maybe go into some precious metals. Just take some risk off the table. You're not admitting you're going to be right completely. You're still got money invested in the market, but you pull back when the market is at all-time highs.
Well, excellent. Thank you very much. We've concluded our 250-minute, 2-hour sessions here. So thank you very much for your time today. Let's give Tom and George a big round of applause.
We hope you enjoyed your on-demand course. You may now submit your attendance verification codes. Thank you for attending this TSCPA on-demand video course. We look forward to continuing to serve as your source for high-quality CPE. Have a great day.